Welcome to the fourth and final part of my Moka Pot woodblock print series. I'm finally ready to show you the finished product, but first I'm going to show you some prototype prints and also the final printing process. I never do the final batch of prints to start. First, I always do some test runs. For this print, I did 2 of these runs to start. Here are those initial 2 runs. The top row is the first trial, while the bottom row is the second trial. You can see that there's not a huge difference between these 2 runs, although my prints are slightly more refined on the second trial. However, at this stage, I knew that I wanted to make some changes for the final run. For one, I wanted the background to be a little bit darker, maybe less orange. And 2, I wanted the coffee in the center of the print, in the Moka Pot, to be much darker and deeper. Knowing these changes I wanted to make, it's now time to make the final batch of prints. As usual, it starts with cutting the paper down to size. For this run, I wanted to try a very large batch of prints. Normally, I would say I do about 20 sheets of paper for a run, or I try to make 20 prints. But in this case, I was going for 36. This is mostly because it's a smaller print size, and also it takes a lot of time to go through this whole process. So, while I'm doing this print run, I feel confident about it, so I just decided to try and bump the numbers up. Here I'm going to show the paper preparation process. So this involves moistening the paper in advance to printing. You can see I start with a layer of paper that is not the actual printmaking paper. In this case, I'm just using printer paper, but many people use like newsprint or whatever they have on them. And you can see I'm lightly dampening it with a spray bottle there. So this kind of lays the foundation, and once I have that down, I'm starting to use the actual printing sheets, stacking one on top of the other and adding some water. It's hard to describe how much water you want to add. This is kind of something that I've slowly learned over time, how much to add to each sheet. Of course, it depends on the size of the paper, in addition to other factors. But generally, as long as you're being consistent, the water will be spread evenly throughout, especially because we're going to let it sit for some time. So if you're adding water consistently, you can kind of slowly get an idea of how much you'll want to add. At the end of the whole process, you typically want the sheets to be just lightly damp, and when you touch it, it should feel kind of cool. So once I get to the top of this stack, I'm adding another layer of that just printer paper, generic printer paper on top, sandwiching those together and putting it inside of a plastic bag to keep the moisture in. Those generic sheets of paper on the top and bottom are primarily there to ensure even the edge sheets of the printmaking stack are also evenly distributed with water. But the next major step in the process is to add some pressure to this stack. To do this, I add 2 kind of flat surfaces. You can see a plank of wood and a book there, and then about 10 to 20 pounds of weight. I generally wait about half a day, and then once I'm ready to print, I remove all the weight. You can probably see printmaking requires some planning. So in this case, I moistened the paper the morning of my print run. Now I'm transferring the moistened paper into one of 2 bags that I'll be using during the printmaking process. So these bags have the Ziploc actually cut out of it so that while I'm printing, it's really easy and quick to reach inside the bag. They still serve the same purpose to keep the moisture in during the printing, but it's important that they're easy to access. Now let's get into the more fun part of the process, the actual printmaking. For this, I'll show raw footage of each impression and kind of talk through what I was thinking about. This first one is an impression that you probably saw in the last video. It's the flat coffee background of the print. So at this point, I've already made 2 print runs as practice, in addition to the early pigment testing that you saw last video. So I'm pretty comfortable with this block. I've learned that getting practice with impressions is actually really important in this hobby. Once you kind of experiment with it, you learn a lot about the very specific details. For example, the block may catch pigment in a certain way if you rub the brush, maybe horizontally, and you need to be aware of not getting too much stuck in the crevices. So at this point, I'm very comfortable with this impression, and I run through the stack pretty quickly. Impression 2 is a gradient, which you also saw in the last video. This one is a little bit more difficult of an impression. Generally, gradients they can be a little bit challenging. And in this video, I actually tried a new technique, which I found to work pretty well for me. You might have seen it just a few seconds ago. I tapped some water across the block in the middle, and then I loaded the brush with pigment on one side. Having that extra water in the middle really helped kind of increase the consistency of my gradients and ensure that there was no hard line present within the center of the print. That was something I was struggling with on the initial print runs, and in general with gradients, I've had trouble with that. The last impression that you've already seen from the last video, and the only difference here is that I added a little bit of Sumi black ink to that coffee. This helps me achieve the deeper, darker coffee color that I was going for in this print. And in addition, during the last two impressions, I also added a hair of Sumi ink, just a little bit on those two, which gave me the darker background, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So this impression is the light gray color of the Moka Pot, and it will also act as the highlights of the Moka Pot when I add the next impression, which is kind of the shadow layer. One thing to point out about this impression is that it overlaps a good amount with the background impression. The reason for this is that I always bias my carving to overlap rather than to be too small. The reason for this is because it allows me to make future modifications to the blocks, but also because the key lines will ultimately hide those overlapping areas. Both this impression and the next impression also include the coffee area, which will further help to darken that color. As I mentioned earlier, this impression will act as the shadows of the Moka Pot. So it's basically the same region as the last print, but it has a few regions carved out for the highlights. The pigment I used here was pretty much the same as the last run, except I added just a hair more of Sumi ink to the bowl. So this will help me increase the contrast between the shadows and the highlights just a little bit. I didn't want it to be too big of a difference, and this was something that I kind of learned from my trial impressions. I learned what level of contrast I wanted there. I have to say that I often really appreciate the look of the print without the key lines. This might be something that I try in the future with a print. Finally, the key line impression. This one is a very quick impression, but it requires a little bit of touch. Some tips that I've learned with my keyline impressions are that the block, it can't be too wet, otherwise the ink will bleed a little bit on the paper. So usually I just add a little bit of ink, and I also pre-mix my nori into my Sumi ink. I know lots of people don't use nori at all, but I find it helps if I just add a little bit to the ink. So once I spread it around, it's just a quick tap with the Baron. Immediately following the printing, I start the drying process. With these prints, since they have a lot of moisture in them, if you just let them air dry, they'll probably curl up a little bit. So to avoid this, I sandwich them between these, I guess, cardboard-like sheets, and then put some weight on top of it at the end. So here I can fit 4 of these per sheet, so I'll just put 4 down, add a layer of cardboard and then continue the process till I've laid them all out. As a side note, while I'm stacking these prints, I will say that I'm very happy with this run. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was the biggest amount of prints I've ever made at once, and while I was laying them out here, I was really happy with the results. I happen to have this huge alabaster rock in my room, so I can use that for weight right now, which works really well. I typically let the prints dry for at least a day, usually 2. So then I just unload the prints as I'm doing here, and they're almost ready. Seeing the completely finished prints there is such a good feeling. There's been a lot of work that has gone into this, and also it's just good to know that you can't mess anything up at this stage. Although I will say that I'm not perfect, and each batch will have a certain number that I deem unacceptable or vary too much from the rest. I didn't show that footage, but that would be next. After identifying which of those prints are acceptable, it's time to do the signing. Here I number each print, write the title in the middle, and then my signature on the right side. This is another one that I find fun because something about that title just gives the print a finished look to me. I'll come back to this footage and show you the final batch compared to the previous 2. You can see the colors are a little bit darker on this round, both the coffee in the center and the background, which is exactly what I was going for. I think it came out well compared to my expectations. Here are a few nice pictures of the print. Before I wrap up this video, I'll mention that the print can now be viewed on my website and also my Etsy shop. Please see the links in the description if you're interested. If you've made it all the way through this series, thank you so much for taking the time to follow along. I've had a lot of fun working on this one. Please let me know what you thought of it and if there's anything else you want to see more of. I have a lot of fun ideas for future videos, so please stay tuned.